Hi, Joshua. I'm Landon with Awards Watch, and it is such a pleasure to meet with you today to talk about Say Nothing on Hulu. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
I was blown away by the series. Now, I haven't read Patrick Radden Keefe's book, but I know it's a deeply reported nonfiction. And, I'm just so fascinated about, what drew you to this particular story and some of the first decisions that you made, in adapting it into a dramatic series.
Yeah, I mean, everyone should read the book. I feel like the book, it's a brilliant book. Feels like required reading for anyone who is wants to know about the cost of political violence, but then also just from a character standpoint, it's nonfiction, but reads like a sort of propulsive thriller. It's beautifully constructed, spanning decades. And as much as it's a brilliant book, it's also just a lot. Frankly, it's like a giant, beautiful doorstop of a book. And so, when I read the book, two things happened. Number one, it became my new favorite book, like instantly. And also, I just thought like there is no way in hell this is going to get made as a show because it's just not the kind of thing that Hollywood usually does. It's it's an epic about like compromise versus ideals, about the cost of political violence. You're following these two sisters from days of idealism to disillusionment, and it's just so much to bite off. You sort of like I've sat down and thought about what the show would look like, and it's a little bit like a cold gust of wind hits you just thinking about, okay, like how are we going to do this? And I think for me in doing it, I read the book and instantly had this dilemma, which was, do I want to make something that like Hollywood is like very inclined to make, a sort of more like normative project, right? Or do I take a real risk on a project that I truly loved, but was like likely to not make it through development? And I've been in the industry for, I don't know, 20 years, something 15, 20 years. And, the dirty secret of Hollywood is like most things don't get made, right? And so for me, I was just like, I loved the story so much. I had a familiarity with the Troubles because the first time I was ever paid to write was actually a story about the IRA when I was in my 20s. So I was already like very steeped in the world, and I just love the story so much. I said yes, and I've spent the last 5 years making Say Nothing.
Oh, I believe it, and I can only imagine how reading that book, every page, every episode, every scene, even the opening scene, where Jean is, abducted. Were there any parts of the book that you knew immediately, as soon as you read it, Josh, that it had to be put in the show? Like, for example, Jean being abducted at the beginning, or, the Old Bailey bombing. Were there certain things you said, there's no exception here. It's going to be difficult, but we need to put it on screen?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the kidnapping of Gene McConville, the abduction is really locks you immediately into the cost of political violence, and you need to see that cost kind of right up front. You need to know that these are the stakes of the story, and that on some fundamental level, like you may be locked in emotionally to characters who are in the IRA, but you're not saying that the people in the IRA are like quote unquote good guys, you know.
Right.
And you know that because of the kidnapping at the beginning. And so it's not to say that they're inherently bad guys, right? That it's not a show like that really is out to make moral judgments. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to do it as an outsider, as an American, is because from thousands of miles away, you don't have a political axe to grind, right? I'm not in it to sort of like vilify or glorify anyone. I'm just interested in the humanity of the characters. And the complications and the messiness and all of that. And so, as far as scenes that had to be in it, certainly the Old Bailey bombing, You can't have the show without that. You have to show how far Dolours and Marian are going in service of their beliefs. But the funny thing is, there are things when you first read the book that you're like, well, this obviously has to be in the show. Brendan Hughes's prison escape, for instance, which is like, if not the most cinematic moments in the book, certainly one of the top three. There's no prison escape in the show. Like there were no easy answers when trying to tell this story. And in fact, I think for a long time I assumed that there were sequences in the book that I assumed would be in the show that I eventually made the decision to cut. So yeah, no rules other than I knew early on there had to be like one really key difference between the show and the book, which is that Dolours had to be the gravitational center of the story, and the stuff. There's a lot of events that are sort of like outside of her kind of sphere of immediate awareness that then would be shed because she is really the sort of like the emotional core of the show.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, like, how did you approach writing characters like Price with legacies that are still very hotly debated,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's still a lot of, speculation out there. It's like, which path did you take? Did you stay true to the book, or were there creative liberties there?
I mean, you're writing. I was writing a show about the IRA that was heavily, heavily researched. Just beyond the four corners of the book, I spent years researching the troubles, going down like, every road, every dead end I could find. I read every book I could about the troubles. I interviewed ex-IRA members. I combed YouTube and dug up old interviews with Brendan Hughes to pick up like verbal tics and speech patterns. I did so much I visited Belfast, as well, obviously, and then did so much online research from my home in Los Angeles that Google's algorithm actually thought I was in Belfast and started giving me restaurant recommendations on the Falls Road. And so I was in deep. And then, of course, during the process of making the show, I consulted extensively with like our cast from Northern Ireland, our director, Michael Lennox, who filmed every episode of Dairy Girls. And so I want to say, I really tried to do my homework, but at the same time, Dolours and Marian and everybody in the IRA, you're writing about an organization that is shrouded in secrecy, right? That they have a code of silence, and as far as like Dolours' story, the tapes, right, that the book are based on, no one has ever read, other than the people who ran the Belfast Project, no one has heard Dolours' actual tape. So there is not like a end-to-end testimony that you're reading. And so I think at some point, every show has to take creative liberties. When you start, you do years of research, and then at some point, you have to believe you've done enough to actually start to write. And so for me, one of my pet peeves in period shows is when the characters seem to have an awareness that they're living in history, right? And so I really tried to avoid that and instead just make the scenes between the sisters like intimate and more focused on their youth and this kind of question like, okay, what would it be like if you were out robbing a bank, but you still lived with your parents, which is very much what was going on for them. They were still in school, they were still living at home. And so it was really trying to ground it in their youth and knowing the particular like comedic sensibility that they had and that you see in Belfast. And so, yeah, at some point you do enough work, eventually you just have to trust yourself that you can go right.
Yeah, and you've been in the industry for a long time. I was a big fan of you and Peter Berg's Patriots Day. Did that experience on Patriots Day influence this at all? Did you apply anything that you learned on Patriots Day to this project?
I mean, only just the research component, really. Like when I admittedly, was on that movie for a short period of time. I came in to do some script doctoring and ended up getting in touch with the FBI through a consultant friend of mine. And I remember talking to about a half dozen FBI agents, some of whom were very by the book, and some of whom were like very excited to tell me, details that their bosses probably didn't want them to tell, which are always like, that's who you want to be talking to, right? But it was actually that if there was a lesson to be learned from that, it was just like truth is stranger than fiction. The details you get from the real people are always going to be better than what you can make up. I think there's a thing that we have in movies, right? We write so much about um, we write about crime, we write about terrorism, we write about billionaires, we write about all these things. And like it's very easy when you're writing about a world that's not your own to like be informed by other movies, right? Because that's kind of what we've seen. We write about criminals in a certain way because we've watched The Godfather or this or The Sopranos or Goodfellas or whatever, and we're not criminals ourselves, we're not criminals ourselves. And so with this, it was really just like go deep, talk to people, do the research. Don't try to like bullshit your way through it. Excuse me, can I swear? Don't try to, don't try to,
Nice.
okay, don't try to bullshit your way through it by like imitating some other film that you know, or some other TV show that you've seen.
Oh yeah, I mean that's great. And was there a particular character who evolved in unexpected ways throughout the writing process?
Yeah, I think the dynamic between the sisters is the thing that evolved the most during the writers' room. That was the thing we were really focused on. I had an amazing writers' room. Kirsten Sheridan, who is Jim Sheridan's daughter, who's a filmmaker, writer. Claire Barron, who is a playwright from New York, and Joe Murdaugh, who created Woman in the Wall and was a showrunner in his own right. You know, and all the like Kirsten has been nominated for an Oscar. Claire's been nominated for a Pulitzer. Joe is like a showrunner. Like it was a formidable room, right? And so there was a lot of debate sort of about the sisters and what was the most kind of like interesting, human, subversive way to go. And so that's the thing that I think because you know there's a lot of their dynamic. There's a lot of their dynamic that's built around kind of like stories we heard about them, talking to people, consulting with people, versus like you know versus what's in the book. So I think that was the thing that evolved the most, I would say.
Did you feel a certain responsibility to portray the IRA and the British government with a certain balance, or did the book just pretty much dictate the storytelling and the framing?
No, not I would say not at all. Like I think that the book is very good at staying balanced. And once you're sort of like inside a character's point of view, that's just it's inherently different to watch a show from the point of view of somebody who is 20 years old and like picking up a gun for the first time to kind of like get in that headspace. It's just a different thing, like seeing them do it and seeing the world through their eyes than it is like reading about it in a nonfiction book. Um, you know, the book is not going in their heads in that way because it can't. It's not a novel. And so I think that I think now I've lost. Now, what was your question again? I think that.
Just the balance between portraying
Oh,
the IRA and the British government, you know,
that's right. That's right. Thank you.
how the
Sorry.
story, the book dictated it.
No, and the book is very balanced. I think it was very important to me that we have British characters that are not cutouts. And so, you know, the Doctor in episode 6 is sort of as humane and conflicted a character as any of the other characters in the show, as well as like, you know, even like the soldier that Dolours um, has her relationship with in episode 3. It was very important that like they weren't just people talking about politics, you know, they're not having like an intellectual discussion about ideology. They're like having a flirtatious discussion where you think something might happen, it might lead to something, you know, and so in the book, that's like a paragraph, right? There's like a paragraph of Dullar's relationships with the soldiers in Northern Ireland and how kind of fraught those relationships were. And in the writers' room, we really took that idea, what would happen if Dullar's had a relationship with her sworn enemy, and kind of like ran with it, right? And drew it out into an episode long arc. And that's really the business of doing a story like this is like you have to shed a lot of it. You have to kind of like trim a lot of it away focus on these ideas that are emotional, that feel really potent, and then really try to expand on them in ways that feel, human, funny, realistic, etc.
Absolutely. Humanizing it's so important because we get that emotional charge. We're invested. It's not just an account like the book, we're like you said, it's very humanized and it's very invested. Now, there are still political tensions still in Northern Ireland to this day. Were there moments when you questioned how far should I go?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I think the sensitivity is so key. I mean, in filming the show, we filmed the show in partly in Belfast and then in England, kind of built a backlot where we could create a world um, like a city block that looked like Belfast in 1972. And there's a lot of reasons to do that. Firstly, Belfast, because of the bombings, the city has all been rebuilt, so the architecture has changed. But more, even more than that, if you're going to drive an armored personnel carrier down the street, just the sound of that vehicle, the specific sound of the engine is actually going to like re-traumatize people in Belfast. And so it's one of the reasons that because we had a long shoot, we were not going to like film that stuff in Belfast. And that's just like one example out of 1,000 where you're really just trying to be sensitive. Anytime there was something extremely sensitive on screen, you're taking as few creative licenses as possible. You're trying to stay absolutely like as true to it as you can without embellishments, even if those things might be enticing, you know? And I
Mhm.
think the more sensitive the more sensitive, the like less risk you want to take. And I think, and then there's other things like the sister's bank robbery, where like it's larky. Dulles has a quote in real life where she says, "I'm ashamed to admit it, but there was fun in those days." And we really took that to heart, right, in the writers' room, where despite the situation being terrible, despite, people, there being violence on this popping off on the streets every day, for Dulles, it's heady. It's like it's the time when she feels most alive. And it's actually only later during peacetime when her world like her interior is kind of crumbling. And so for the bank robbery, for instance, that's like, all we knew really is that Dulles robbed a bank dressed like a nun. There are about 6 characters in that bank that are, all representing like a different facet of life in Belfast. There's the Protestant manager, there's the Catholic underling who sort of like comes over to Dulles' side and, speaks to her in Irish, which she knows probably that her Protestant manager does not speak in order to communicate to Dulles. There's there's all this interplay that's obviously fictionalized, but meant to kind of like give you the spirit of Belfast in its kind of contradictions. It's one line in the book, and it's a 6-page sequence, on screen. So yeah, I think there's moments when you can take creative license, and then there's other moments where you can't at all.
I think that's really well said and probably great advice for anyone who's going to tackle some politically, motivated kind of content. I think that's probably like a really great piece of advice. So we'll definitely want to share that with other filmmakers. Um, you talked a little bit about behind the scenes. I'm so glad you talked about the trauma and like people just hearing the cars and explosions and what that would do. What was it like working with Irish and British actors on such a politically charged series? Did their perspectives shape the material?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I gave the scripts to the actors, specifically the actors from Belfast. I'm from California, so that's like you're clenched when you're doing that. You're like handing them the pages, just being like, and at some point you have to just be like, just tell me where I've screwed up. Just be honest, and like the door is open. If something feels fake to you, like I will not have hurt feelings. Like there's no way I'm going to be able to get all of this right. So if there are moments when you're just like wrinkling your nose because something smells funny, just let me know. And so that was the first thing, was sort of like taking your ego out of it.
Mhm.
And then luckily I'd done enough research he says with his ego fully intact, I had done enough research that weren't a lot of times where they were like, this is fake. There was, like I remember having conversations with Michael Lennox where he's like, I don't believe this interaction would happen like in this location. It would need to be like this other location. And there's stuff like that happened, but it was actually kind of minimal in the end. And then the thing that did happen that was really interesting, we have military advisors on the show, right? For the British military who have a very different perspective than the people who have, the cast members who have family members who are Republicans, right? And so that was certainly like a line to walk. I remember we had one military advisor who didn't think who had a problem with the fact that there's a scene where the British Army is in plain clothes and didn't announce themselves as military. And he was like, he said they wouldn't do that. I was there. I was in Belfast. And it was a charged moment. And we ended up talking for a long time. And I showed him this documentary online that showed that, yes, in fact, the British Army did do that, particularly under some of these units that were run by Frank Kitson, which were kind of like undercover units. And he said, he apologized and said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. And so it was that stuff was very complicated. Everybody has their own perspective. And then also, I think, there were a few members of the crew who were British, and I think had a great sense of guilt about this sort of like legacy that in the relationship between Ireland and England, and I think that impacted so whether it was like performances or direction or whatever it was, and that was something to like work through. But everybody tried to stay open and communicative, and there was the nice thing about the show. It was a hard shoot because of the sheer ambition and the magnitude and the scope, right? But there was no big personality that was making it a nightmare for everyone else, which like so often you have just somebody who's having a really hard time and on a shoot makes it a challenge for everybody else. And we had 215 speaking parts, and we didn't have that person. So that was, I think, a testament to the kind of like communication on set.
Absolutely. And your mindfulness and you being aware and listening and that compassionate ear. I mean, that's all amazing. That's great. And I think, like I said, I think that's really great advice for anyone who's tackling similar content. How involved was Patrick Keefe in the adaptation process, or if at all?
Yeah, I mean, he was sort of like, he would kind of pop in and out of the writer's room, to talk to people. And he was always a good barometer for like, what feels too sensitive, for lack of a what better word, like what can we get away with, and Patrick is terrific. He's very much, he was a real producer on the show. He would go, he went on the location scouts, he did the work, he was really there. And he's great. He's also somebody who understands, the difference between a book and a show. And so really, I've worked with a lot of novelists. I've worked with some novelists who just don't want you to change a word. And I think Patrick really understood fundamentally that they're different mediums. And, he's a screenwriter himself. And so I think anybody would be lucky to work with him.
Great. And after on the heels of Belfast, Kenneth Branagh's Belfast, a couple years ago, it got awards consideration, Oscars. There was a lot of parallels with drawing the political tensions in Northern Ireland to America currently today, with the political tensions rising. What do you hope American audiences take away from this history, which may or may not be unfamiliar to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big questions of the show is like how people get swept up in a cause. I've sort of said this before, but when we were in the writer's room, the murder of George Floyd occurred, I think, while we were working on the show, and people were taken to the streets. people, the people in the writers' room were going to protests, and often, the person at the center of it, the person with the bullhorn, would be about 17 years old. And so there was a question, is like, what does it feel like to be that kid? What does it feel like to get under the skin of somebody who is really getting swept up in like in a seismic culture shifting moment? And so that was sort of the core idea behind the certainly the first few episodes in the show. And then like what happens if you follow that person over the course of 30, 40 years when like maybe their ideals, either they're clinging to them or they're no longer intact, right? And so I think for us, the the goal with the show is like whether you agree with what the IRA is doing or don't agree with what they're doing, whether you think the Price sisters are heroes or monsters, kind of depends on who you ask. And so for us, no matter what you think of what they're doing, I think the goal with the show is like people who are out there day to day putting their beliefs on the line, like, kind of living their beliefs, for lack of a better word, that is worthy of psychological exploration especially in a world where like it's really easy to like repost something on Instagram. What does it mean to actually be out there in the streets doing things that are morally very compromising in service of your beliefs?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's very inspiring as well. Is there one moment or a scene in the series that you think best captures what Say Nothing is really about?
Oh gosh, there's a lot because it's about a lot of different things, but I would say that the relationship between Dolours and Joe Linsky in episode 3, where she befriends this guy who is sort of an awkward older man, but also incredibly charming, played just sorry, I'm like getting emotional thinking about it, like played so well by our actor Adam Best. And she has this relationship with this awkward older man. He's kind of like he seems kind of like an awkward uncle to her, at least on screen. And uh, and then at some point she gets the order that she has to drive him to his death. And at that moment, the fun stops, and she realizes that this path she's on is going to take turns that she really wasn't expecting, and that ethically she's stepping into a kind of darkness where these choices that she's making now are going to haunt her for the rest of her life. And that to me, that moment where where he leaves, she's taken him over the border after this emotional car ride, and then she drives home and sort of cries the whole way home. That would be the moment that I would point to.
Yeah, no, pivotal. And I could see why, that's the moment where we're kind of looking back and saying, okay, it's kind of like, did you go too far, and how far are you going to continue to go? It's like her moment of clarity and like, oh, she's really pushed to the limit at that point.
And that is one of the big questions of the show is how far would you go for your beliefs?
Yeah, and that brings me, to my final question. With historical dramas booming in prestige, what sets Say Nothing apart, and how it treats the truth, memory, and the cost of loyalty, in your opinion?
Gosh. Um, I think the sort of like the thing that sets it apart for me, there are two things. And I also don't want to say it's like better than anything else. So the thing that feels special to me about the show, besides just the extraordinary acting, the fact that most Americans are unfamiliar with our cast of over 200, and that the entry into a world that people may not know a lot about, right? The things that to me make it special are actually the balance of humor and pathos, the sensibility where it feels like the world is falling apart and the characters kind of can't help but laugh sometimes. That it's a taking on dark subject matter with an attitude but with an attitude that feels very, very Belfast, right? Um, and then also, frankly, just the commitment to authenticity, the commitment to, um, you know, making a show that is walking a tightrope, where on the one hand, it's accessible to. We tried to make it accessible to people who had never heard of the Troubles, but then also for me, it was so important to have a show that people from Belfast could look at and sort of recognize their story in the show. I'm an American, obviously, and I really felt strongly that I didn't want I didn't want to blunder into like someone else's story and fuck it up, frankly. And I think for me, um, it's very important that you can know nothing about the Troubles and love the show or be impacted by the show, and then also that people from kind of back home can see it and feel like it feels like their story. That's what to me sets it apart.
I completely agree. And Keith was so lucky to have you to adapt this series. I mean, it's wonderful. You're so thoughtful. Thank you again for creating it. I think the impact is going to be very huge with everyone watching this and seeing, oh, how close, is America to this, and what are the political divisions, and what does that look like when you really accelerate it? So thank you so much for creating this and for being mindful and thoughtful. It was such a pleasure to speak with you, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for talking to me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Josh. Have a good one.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Take
See you.
care. I see you.